The morning started like any other day for Ambassador Zixthor, as he sat in his observation station high above the edge of human space and watched the streams of data flowing from Earth like a river of light. For 10 years he had monitored the humans, and for 10 years they had remained in their small corner of the galaxy, like children confined to a playroom. He found them frustrating and fascinating in equal measure, because they never seemed content with what they had and always pushed against the boundaries the Council had set for them. The Galactic Council had made their decision about humanity 300 years ago when the humans first developed faster-than-light travel and burst into space with the enthusiasm of youth and the recklessness of inexperience. The Council had watched dozens of species reach this milestone over thousands of years, and they knew the pattern well enough to predict what came next. Young species needed guidance and boundaries, or they would spread too fast and burn themselves out, or, worse yet, threaten the carefully maintained balance of galactic civilization. So, the Council had sent their diplomats to Earth with a simple message, which was to stay within their solar system until they proved they could govern themselves peacefully and respect the territories of others. Most species accepted this with grace and understood it as necessary wisdom from their elders. Humanity had accepted it too, but Zixthor had always sensed their resentment simmering beneath the surface of diplomatic smiles. He took a sip of his morning nutrients and glanced at the monitoring screens that showed him everything happening in human space, from the busy orbital stations around Earth to the mining operations in the asteroid belt to the research facilities near Jupiter. 60 billion humans lived in that system now, and every single one of them produced data that flowed through networks of communication satellites and relay stations. The noise of human civilization was constant and chaotic and loud. Then it stopped. At first Zixthor thought it was a malfunction in his equipment, because civilizations did not simply go silent, and he ran diagnostics on his systems, while his heart began to beat faster in his chest. The diagnostics came back clean, which meant the problem was not on his end. He expanded his scans and reached out to the automated monitoring stations that the Council had placed throughout human space. They were still functioning and sending data, but the data they sent showed nothing but empty silence, no communication. Signals came from Earth, and no traffic moved between the orbital stations, and no mining ships harvested asteroids in the belt. The entire human civilization had gone quiet in an instant, like someone had flipped a switch and turned them all off. Zixthor felt ice water flood his veins as he realized what he was seeing, because in all his years of service he had never encountered anything like this. He launched a probe toward Earth's largest orbital station and watched its progress on his screens while his mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps there had been some kind of technological failure, or a solar event that disrupted their systems. Perhaps there had been a plague that struck so quickly they had no time to send warnings. Perhaps there had been a civil war that ended in mutual destruction. Each possibility seemed less likely than the last. The probe reached the orbital station and transmitted its findings back to him. The station was intact with no signs of damage or combat. Life support systems were running and lights were on and doors were sealed properly. But there was no one there. The probe's cameras showed corridors empty of people and control rooms, abandoned with displays still showing readouts and monitors still tracking data that no one was watching anymore. In the station's cafeteria, the probe found tables with meals half eaten, as if people had simply stood up in the middle of lunch and walked away. In the living quarters, it found personal belongings scattered about and photos on walls and books left open on beds. Everything suggested that the occupants had intended to return at any moment, but none of them had. Zixthor sent more probes to more locations, and each one told the same impossible story. The colonies on Mars were empty and the domes were intact but lifeless. The mining stations in the asteroid belt were abandoned, with equipment still running and ore still sitting in processing bins. The research facilities orbiting Jupiter showed no signs of their scientists or crew. Everywhere the probes looked, they found the infrastructure of human civilization functioning perfectly, but the humans themselves were simply gone. Drafted an emergency report to the Council and marked it with the highest priority codes. Within hours, the Council convened an emergency session, and representatives from 200 species gathered in the Great Chamber to hear his report. Zixthor stood before them and showed them his findings, while the assembled diplomats watched in growing disbelief. The chamber that normally buzzed with conversation and debate fell into shocked silence as the evidence mounted. 60 billion humans had vanished without warning or explanation. They had left behind everything that was not portable and taken everything that was. Most disturbing of all was the pattern Zixthor had noticed in the abandoned facilities. Every civilian location showed signs of hasty but orderly departure, with personal items left behind but essential supplies removed. Every military installation told a different story because they had been stripped methodically and completely. Weapons were gone and vehicles were gone, and the shipyards where humanity had been constructing their defense fleet were empty of everything except the infrastructure itself. Hi. Arbiter Kelnash spoke first, and her crystalline form reflected the chamber lights in anxious patterns as she asked the question everyone was thinking. Where had they gone, and why had they left, and what did it mean for the rest of the galaxy? Zixthor had no good answers for her because the evidence pointed in directions he did not want to follow. Humans did not run from threats, and they did not abandon their homes without reason. In all his years of observing them, he had learned that much about their nature. They faced problems head-on and fought against impossible odds and never accepted defeat easily. So if they had left their homeworld behind, it was not because they were fleeing from something, but because they were moving toward something. He shared his final piece of evidence with the Council, which was the quantum signature readings he had detected around Earth's moon. Something massive had been there, and something that bent space-time in ways that current technology should not allow. Whatever the humans had built to evacuate, their entire civilization, it was far more advanced than anything they had shown the Council. During their centuries of observation, Ambassador Kelvin, who was the oldest member of the Council and had observed the rise and fall of civilizations for longer than most species had existed, finally spoke into the heavy silence. His voice carried weight that made everyone listen when he said that they were asking the wrong questions. The question was not where humanity had gone, but why they felt they needed to leave in secret and what they planned to do now that they were free of Council oversight. Thor realized with growing dread that Kelvin was right, because humanity had not disappeared by accident or catastrophe, but by choice and planning and careful execution. They had removed themselves from the equation entirely, and somewhere, out in the vast darkness of space, 60 billion humans were building something new. The Council wasted no time assembling an investigation team because the disappearance of an entire species was unprecedented in galactic history and demanded immediate answers. Dr. Halvex was chosen to lead the expedition because he had spent centuries studying spatial anomalies and quantum mechanics, and if anyone could figure out how humanity had accomplished this impossible feat, it would be him. He selected specialists from a dozen different species, and each brought unique expertise that might help solve the mystery. The investigation fleet arrived at Earth 3 weeks after the initial discovery, and Halvex stood on the bridge of his ship looking down at the blue and green planet that spun silently below. From orbit, Earth looked peaceful and alive, with clouds drifting across oceans and continents clearly visible beneath. It was only when they scanned for electronic signals and detected nothing but automated systems that the true strangeness became apparent. They landed in what had been called New York and found a city frozen in time, like a museum exhibit of human civilization. Traffic lights changed colors for empty streets, and subway trains ran their scheduled routes through tunnels with no passengers. Power plants hummed with energy, feeding a grid that powered millions of homes where no one lived anymore. The automated systems had been programmed well, and they continued their tasks without question or complaint. Halvex walked through streets lined with abandoned vehicles and stores with their doors left unlocked and inventory still on shelves. He entered an apartment building and climbed to the 5th floor, where he found a small living space that told him more about humanity than any report ever had. The walls were covered with photographs of people smiling and embracing, and the shelves held books about exploration and adventure and dreams of distant stars. On the kitchen counter, a coffee maker sat with a full cup of cold coffee that had been brewed that morning by a timer set months ago. The investigation team split up and examined different cities across the Palais. Ned and each team reported similar findings. London was empty but intact, and Tokyo showed no signs of struggle, and Moscow stood silent with snow falling on streets that no one walked. Everywhere they looked, they found evidence of organized departure rather than panicked flight. People had taken their important belongings and left everything else behind, as if they planned to return someday but knew it might be a very long time. But It was the military installations that truly disturbed Halvex and his team because those sites told a different story entirely. They visited what had been the largest military base in North America and found it stripped completely bare. Warehouses that should have held weapons and ammunition were empty, and vehicle depots showed nothing but oil stains where heavy machinery had once sat. The armories had been cleaned out so thoroughly that even the spare parts and tools were gone. The orbital shipyards above Earth painted an even more concerning picture because humanity had been building warships there for decades under the watchful eye of Council observers. Those observers had filed reports noting that human ship designs were innovative and efficient, and perhaps too advanced for such a young species. Now the shipyards stood empty and the warships that had been under construction were missing along with every piece of equipment that could be moved. Halvex spent days analyzing the quantum signatures around Earth's moon, and the data he collected made him increasingly uneasy. The readings showed evidence of massive gravitational distortions consistent with ships much larger than anything humanity had publicly demonstrated. The energy requirements alone suggested technology that should have taken centuries to develop, yet somehow humanity had built it in secret while pretending to accept their limitations. The team discovered something else that changed their understanding of the situation completely. In an abandoned government facility in what had been called Geneva, they found server rooms that still held massive amounts of data. The computers had been left running and their files had not been deleted or destroyed. It took the team's best cryptographers 2 days to break the security protocols, but when they did, they found detailed plans spanning decades. The files showed that humanity had known for 50 years that the Council would never willingly grant them freedom to expand. They had accepted the restrictions publicly while privately preparing for the day they would leave. They had built their evacuation fleet in secret using asteroid mining operations as cover, and they had surveyed hundreds of potential colony worlds far beyond Council space. They had practiced the logistics of moving 60 billion people, and they had stockpiled supplies and resources for years. What struck Halvex most was the level of coordination required to pull off such a feat, because every human on Earth and Mars and the orbital stations had to know the plan and keep the secret. 60 billion individuals had worked together toward a single goal without a single leak or warning reaching Council observers. The level of unity and determination that implied was frightening. The investigation team found one more thing in that facility, which was a message left on a large display screen in what had been the main command center. The screen had been programmed to activate when sensors detected non-human life forms, and when Halvex entered the room, it flickered to life. The message was brief and written in the common galactic language, so there would be no misunderstanding. The words on the screen said that humanity was done waiting for permission and done accepting boundaries imposed by others and done pretending to be content in their cage. They thanked the Council for teaching them patience and planning, and the importance of unity in the face of external pressure. They promised they would not attack Council worlds or threaten existing territories, but they also promised they would never accept restrictions on their freedom again. Halvex read the message 3 times while his team stood silently behind him. He understood now what had happened and why it had happened and what it meant for the future of galactic civilization. Humanity had not disappeared because they were afraid, and they had not fled because they were weak. They had left because they were strong enough to leave and smart enough to do it in a way that gave the Council no chance to stop them. He sent his report back to the Council and chose his words carefully because what he had to say would cause panic among species that had grown comfortable with their power and authority. Humanity had left Earth behind, but they had not left the galaxy, and they were out there somewhere building something new and growing stronger every day. The question was not whether the Council would eventually encounter them again, but whether the Council would be ready. When that meeting happened, the investigation team packed up their equipment and prepared to leave Earth behind. As their ships lifted off, Halvex took one last look at the empty planet below and wondered what humanity was building with all that salvaged military equipment and those advanced ships. Whatever it was, he suspected the galaxy would find out soon enough, and he was not sure anyone would like the answer. The Council chamber erupted into chaos when Halvex finished presenting his findings, and representatives from 200 species all tried to speak at once. Some demanded immediate action to find humanity and force them back into compliance, while others argued that the disappearance was actually a blessing that removed a dangerous element from galactic civilization. The debate raged for hours as diplomats argued about jurisdiction and precedent, and what it meant that an entire species could simply vanish. Sixthor sat quietly and listened to the arguments swirl around him while his mind kept returning to the message humanity had left behind. They were done waiting for permission, and that simple statement carried implications that most of the council members seemed unwilling to face. He had spent 10 years watching humanity, and he understood them better than most, and what he understood made him deeply worried about what would come next. The Velkin representative stood and proposed sending military forces to search for human colonies and dismantle them before they could establish a foothold beyond council space. Several other species voiced their agreement and spoke about the need to maintain order and enforce the rules that held galactic civilization together. Sixthor felt compelled to speak even though he knew his words would not be welcome. He stood and waited for the chamber to quiet before speaking in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the vast room. He reminded them that humanity had complied with council restrictions for over a century and had asked repeatedly for permission to expand peacefully and had been denied every time. They had followed the rules and played the diplomatic game and done everything the council had asked of them, and it had gained them nothing but continued confinement. The Velkin representative interrupted to say that the restrictions had been necessary because humanity was too aggressive and too unpredictable and too dangerous to be allowed free rein in the galaxy. Sixthor nodded and asked a simple question, which was how many species currently on the council had been considered dangerous before they joined. The chamber fell silent as diplomats looked at each other and realized the uncomfortable truth. Ambassador Kelvin rose slowly from his seat, and the entire chamber gave him their attention because he rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried the weight of centuries. His species had been observing galactic civilization since before most current members had even developed space travel, and he had seen patterns repeat themselves across generations. He looked around at the assembled representatives, with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Kelvin spoke in his deep, gravelly voice and said that they were all fools if they thought humanity's departure was about fear or weakness. He listed the species on the council and reminded them of their histories and how many had expanded through conquest and how many had seized territory by force and how many had ignored council warnings until they were strong enough to demand respect. 32 species had required military intervention before accepting council authority, and yet humanity had never raised a weapon against any council member. He said that every successful species in the galaxy had expanded aggressively when they reached the stars because that was how species survived and grew strong. The council had never asked any of them to wait patiently in their home systems for a century, while bureaucrats debated their readiness. But humanity had been expected to do exactly that, and they had complied for far longer than anyone had a right to expect. The chamber remained quiet as Kelvin continued and explained what should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. Humanity had not attacked council ships or invaded council territories or made any hostile moves whatsoever. They had simply removed themselves from a situation where they would never be treated as equals and had gone to build their own future somewhere else. The fact that they had managed to evacuate 60 billion people in complete secrecy demonstrated planning and capability that rivaled any species in the galaxy. Sixthor watched the faces of the other representatives as Kelvin spoke and saw understanding dawn in their eyes, followed quickly by fear. They had all assumed humanity would remain contained and grateful for whatever scraps of freedom the council chose to grant them. None of them had considered that humanity might simply stop playing a game they could never win and start playing by their own rules instead. The debate shifted after Kelvin's speech, and instead of arguing about whether to punish humanity, the council began discussing what humanity's departure meant for the balance of power in the galaxy. If one species could successfully resist council authority, then others might follow, and the carefully maintained order that had kept peace for thousands of years might begin to crack. That was when the first reports arrived from the frontier regions and changed the conversation entirely. A trade convoy from the Zephine Commerce Guild had gone missing near the outer reaches, which was a vast region of space considered too remote and resource-poor to be worth colonizing. The convoy had been carrying standard goods between established trade routes, and there was no reason for them to have any trouble in such empty space. A Council patrol ship was dispatched to investigate, and what they found sent shockwaves through the galactic community. The trade convoy's ships were intact and floating in space near an uncharted star system, but every crew member was gone, just like the humans had disappeared from Earth. The patrol ship's sensors detected something in the nearby system, and when they moved closer to investigate, they found a planet that should not have been habitable, but clearly was. The planet showed signs of recent terraforming and industrial development on a massive scale. Cities were rising from cleared forests, and agricultural zones, stretched across continents, and orbital platforms surrounded the world like a ring of steel. Most disturbing of all was the fleet of ships in orbit, and they were undeniably human. In design, but more advanced than anything humanity had possessed 3 months ago when they left Earth. The patrol ship's commander sent an urgent message back to the Council and included detailed scans of the human colony. The analysis revealed construction techniques that suggested humanity had been planning this for decades and had hidden the full extent of their technological capabilities from Council observers. The ships in orbit mounted weapons systems that Council scientists could not fully identify, and the defensive platforms around the planet would make any assault extremely costly. Zix Thor read the report and felt his worst fears confirmed, because humanity had not fled into exile or gone into hiding. They had executed a strategic withdrawal and established themselves in territory the Council had ignored, and now they were building something that could challenge the established order. The question was no longer whether humanity would eventually seek to rejoin galactic civilization, but whether they would do so as supplicants or as conquerors. The Council faced an impossible choice, and they could send their military forces to destroy the human colony and risk open war with a species that had proven itself capable of remarkable feats, or they could accept that humanity had successfully escaped their control and hope that future relations could be managed peacefully. Either choice carried enormous risks, and neither guaranteed the stability that the Council desperately wanted to maintain. Kelvin spoke again, and reminded them that humanity had not attacked the trade convoy, but had simply relocated the crews somewhere safe before claiming the territory as their own. It was a message and a warning that said humanity was willing to defend what they built, but did not seek unnecessary conflict. The choice of how to respond belonged to the Council, but Kelvin suggested they choose very carefully, because underestimating humanity had already cost them their credibility. Captain Yora stood on the bridge of her patrol ship and stared at the display showing the human fleet in orbit around the colony world. She had been a military officer for 30 years and had seen countless ship designs from dozens of species, but what she was looking at now made her deeply uncomfortable. The human vessels were sleek and efficient, with lines that suggested speed and weapons placement that indicated they had learned a great deal from studying Council military technology. Her tactical officer reported that the human fleet consisted of 17 warships, and each one was comparable in size to Council heavy cruisers, but with power signatures that suggested more advanced reactor systems. There were also dozens of smaller vessels that appeared to be patrol craft and cargo haulers, and several massive colony ships that must have carried thousands of people each. The entire operation spoke of planning and resources and capability that humanity should not have possessed. Yora ordered her communications officer to send a hail to the human fleet, and waited while her heart beat faster in her chest. For a long moment there was no response, and she began to wonder if the humans would simply ignore her or, worse yet, open fire without warning. Then a face appeared on her main display, and Yora found herself looking at a human woman who wore a military uniform that combined elements of old Earth naval traditions with practical modern design. The woman introduced herself as Commander Lisa Grant of the Earth Colonial Fleet, and her voice was calm and professional, but her eyes were hard as steel. She asked what business the Council had in this region of space, and Yora felt her diplomatic training kick in as she explained that the patrol was investigating the disappearance of a trade convoy. Lisa nodded slowly and said that the convoy crews were safe and would be returned to Council space once humanity finished establishing its territorial claims. Yora felt her temper rise at the casual way Lisa spoke about taking Council citizens and claiming territory without authorization. She stated clearly that the Council had not approved human expansion into this region, and that humanity was in violation of multiple treaties and agreements. Lisa's expression did not change as she replied that humanity was no longer bound by treaties they had never truly been part of. The conversation grew tense as Yora insisted that there would be consequences if humanity did not comply with council law. Lisa leaned forward slightly and asked a simple question, which was how many ships the council had in this region. Yora hesitated because the answer was not encouraging, and her patrol consisted of only 3 vessels, while the human fleet before her could easily overwhelm them. Lisa continued speaking, and explained that humanity now controlled 17 colonies in the outer reaches, with 12 more under construction. Each colony was being built with the same efficiency and speed that had allowed them to evacuate Earth, and each one was defended by ships that incorporated technology. Humanity had developed in secret over decades. She said that humanity had spent a century studying Council technology and learning from Council military tactics, and now they were putting those lessons to use. Yora realized with growing dread that this was not a negotiation, but a statement of fact. Humanity was informing the Council of what they had done, rather than asking permission or seeking approval. Lisa made it clear that human ships would respect existing Council territories and would not attack Council vessels unless attacked first. But she also made it absolutely clear that humanity would defend their new colonies with everything they had. The display showed more data as Lisa shared information about human expansion, and Yora saw that the colonies were spread across a vast region of space that the Council had always considered too remote to be valuable. Humanity had chosen their territory carefully and had avoided any areas that might bring them into direct conflict with established powers. They were building their empire in the gaps and empty spaces that everyone else had ignored. Lisa explained that every colony was self-sufficient within months of establishment because humanity had learned efficiency through necessity during their century of confinement. They grew their own food and manufactured their own equipment and mined their own resources, and they did it all without depending on Council trade or Council technology. Each colony made them stronger, and each month brought them closer to being a power that could not be ignored or pushed around. Yora tried one more time to assert Council authority and warned that military forces would be sent to enforce compliance if necessary. Lisa smiled, but there was no warmth in her expression, and she asked if Yora really thought the Council would start a war over territory they had never wanted. She pointed out that human colonies were not taking anything from Council members and were not threatening anyone who did not threaten them first. The logic was sound, and Yora knew it even as she hated to admit it. The Council could send fleets to attack human colonies, but doing so would cost lives and resources and political capital for gains that were questionable at best. The outer reaches had always been considered worthless, and now humanity was proving that with enough determination and technology, any space could be made valuable. Lisa offered Yora and her patrol safe passage back to Council space, and suggested that future communications should go through proper diplomatic channels that humanity was establishing. She said that humanity did not want war but would not accept subjugation, and the Council would need to decide which relationship they preferred. Then she terminated the connection and left Yora staring at an empty screen while her crew looked to her for orders. Yora knew she had no good options because attacking would be suicide and retreating would look like weakness, but staying accomplished nothing. She ordered her ships to withdraw and began composing her report to the Council, while her mind raced through the implications of what she had witnessed. Humanity had done more than escaped their confinement, and they had built the foundation of an interstellar civilization in just 3 months. The patrol ship jumped back to Council space, and Yora spent the journey writing and rewriting her report because the words felt inadequate to convey what she had seen. She tried to explain that humanity was not acting like a species seeking to rejoin the galactic community, but rather like a species that had decided to build their own community and might eventually allow others to join if they proved worthy. When Yora's report reached the Council, it sparked immediate emergency sessions and military commanders were summoned to assess the threat. Strategic analysts pored over the data she had collected and tried to calculate how many ships it would take to dislodge humanity from their new colonies. The numbers were not encouraging because every estimate suggested that attacking human positions would be extremely costly and might not even succeed. Some council members argued for immediate military action before humanity grew even stronger, while others counseled patience and suggested opening diplomatic channels. The debate revealed deep divisions within the council about how to handle a species that refused to follow the established rules. Humanity had found a loophole in the system by expanding into space that no one else wanted, and now they were exploiting that loophole with ruthless efficiency. Zixthor listened to the debates and thought about Lisa Grant's hard eyes and confident words. He had warned the council years ago that humanity was dangerous, not because they were violent, but because they were adaptable and determined and unwilling to accept limitations. Now his warnings had proven true, and the council faced a choice between accepting humanity as an equal power or spending decades trying to contain a species that had already proven they could not be contained. The question was no longer what humanity would do next, because that was obvious, and they would continue expanding and building and growing stronger until no one could challenge them. The real question was what the council would do, and whether they would learn from this experience or repeat their mistakes with the next species that challenged their authority. Zixthor suspected he already knew the answer, but he hoped desperately that he was wrong. The months following the discovery of human colonies brought a steady stream of reports that painted an increasingly clear picture of what humanity had accomplished. Every week brought news of new settlements appearing in regions of space that the council had mapped but never bothered to colonize. Humanity was spreading across the outer reaches like wildfire, and each new colony was established with the same efficient precision that had allowed them to evacuate Earth without anyone noticing. What troubled the council most was not the speed of human expansion, but the way they went about it. Humanity did not invade occupied territories or challenge existing claims, and they respected the boundaries of every council species with meticulous care. Instead, they claimed every habitable world and resource-rich system that lay outside established borders, and they did so with such speed that by the time the council noticed a new colony, it was already self-sufficient and defended. Within 6 months, humanity controlled more territory than any single council member, and their fleet had grown to rival the largest military forces in known space. Within a year, they had established 40 colonies and controlled shipping lanes that connected them in an efficient network. Within 18 months, they had a functioning interstellar economy and were trading with independent species that operated outside council jurisdiction. The council watched helplessly as humanity did exactly what they had been forbidden to do for a century, and they did it better than anyone had expected. Human colonies thrived in conditions that would have challenged other species, and human ships moved through space with a confidence that came from knowing they answered to no authority but their own. The reports that reached the council chamber painted a picture of a civilization that had been waiting decades for the chance to prove what they could do. Zixthor read every report and watched humanity's expansion with mixed feelings of admiration and concern. He had spent years studying humans, and he understood their psychology better than most council members, but even he had underestimated their capacity for organization and their willingness to sacrifice comfort for freedom. 60 billion people had abandoned the world of their birth and embraced the hardships of colonial life, because living free on a harsh frontier world was better than living comfortably in a cage. The council debated sending military forces to halt human expansion, but every strategic analysis came to the same conclusion, which was that any war with humanity would be long and costly and might not achieve its objectives. Human colonies were scattered across vast distances, and each one was fortified and supplied to withstand siege. Their fleet was designed for defensive operations and hit-and-run tactics that would make occupation nearly impossible. More importantly, the council faced internal divisions about whether military action was justified. Several species argued that humanity had done nothing wrong except refuse to accept arbitrary restrictions, and those species questioned whether the council had the moral authority to enforce rules that seemed designed to maintain the power of established members rather than promote galactic peace. Ambassador Kelvin used his influence to push for a diplomatic solution, and he argued that attempting to crush humanity would only prove that the council was exactly what humanity claimed it was, which was a club that protected its own interests, rather than a genuine community of equals. His words carried weight, and eventually the council agreed to send a diplomatic mission to negotiate with humanity's new government. Zixthor volunteered to lead the mission because he felt responsible for not seeing this coming, and perhaps because he wanted to understand what humanity had become. The Council agreed and gave him broad authority to negotiate terms that might bring humanity back into the galactic community. He knew the task would be difficult because humanity had no reason to trust the Council and every reason to continue building their independent civilization. The diplomatic mission traveled to a world that humanity had named Haven, and it orbited a yellow star similar to Earth's sun. From orbit, Zixthor could see cities spreading across continents and farms covering fertile valleys and industrial complexes that hummed with activity. The planet had been lifeless rock 3 months ago, but now it supported millions of humans and grew more developed every day. A human shuttle brought Zixthor down to the surface, and he found himself in a city that combined practical frontier architecture with touches of beauty that showed humanity had not forgotten art in their rush to survive. He was taken to a government building where human officials conducted the business of running an interstellar civilization, and there, he met the man who would speak for humanity. John Blake served as Secretary of External Affairs for the United Colonies of Humanity, and he greeted Zixthor with professional courtesy, but without the deference that Council ambassadors usually received. He was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew his civilization was strong enough to stand on its own. They sat in a simple office with windows that looked out over the growing city. Zixthor asked why humanity had chosen to leave Earth rather than continue working within the Council system. John looked at him for a long moment before answering, and his words were measured but firm. He explained that humanity had played by the Council's rules for 100 years, and had proven themselves peaceful and responsible and willing to compromise, but none of it had mattered because the Council never intended to treat them as equals. John said that every species on the Council had expanded freely when they reached the stars, and had taken territory and built empires, and only later been asked to join the galactic community. But humanity had been told to wait and prove themselves, and accept limitations that no other species had ever accepted. The message was clear, which was that humanity would always be junior members at best and pets at worst. Zixthor tried to defend the Council's position by saying that humanity was younger than other species and needed more time to mature. John laughed bitterly and asked how much time would have been enough, because the Council had never given them a timeline or specific goals to achieve. The restrictions had been open-ended and arbitrary, and designed to keep humanity contained rather than help them grow. The conversation continued for hours as they discussed the past and present and possible futures. Zixthor gradually understood that humanity did not hate the Council, but they no longer respected it, and they would never again accept its authority over their affairs. John made it clear that humanity would continue expanding and building and growing until they controlled enough territory and resources to be truly independent. John explained that humanity was willing to engage in trade and diplomacy and mutual defense agreements, but only as equals. They would not seek permission to colonize worlds and would not accept restrictions on their growth, and would not pretend to be grateful for scraps of freedom. If the Council wanted a relationship with humanity, it would have to be a relationship between peers, or there would be no relationship at all. Zixthor asked what would happen if the Council refused those terms, and John's answer was simple and terrifying. He said humanity would continue doing exactly what they were doing, and in 10 years they would control 100 colonies, and in 20 years they would be the strongest single power in the galaxy. The Council could choose to work with them now or deal with them later when humanity was even stronger and even less inclined to compromise. The choice John presented was not really a choice at all, and Zixthor knew it. He prepared to return to Council space with terms that would be difficult for many members to accept, but he also brought a message that needed to be heard. Humanity had not become the Council's enemy, but they had become something perhaps more challenging, which was a power that could not be controlled or contained or dismissed. As Zixthor's ship departed Haven, he composed his final report to the Council, and he chose his words carefully because they would shape how the galaxy responded to humanity's rise. He wrote that humanity had proven themselves capable of everything the Council had feared, and more, but they had also proven themselves capable of restraint and honor. They had not attacked Council worlds or threatened innocent species, and they had built their empire in empty space. that no one else wanted. He wrote that the council faced a fundamental choice about what kind of organization it wanted to be and whether it truly stood for cooperation and mutual respect or merely served to protect the interests of powerful established members. Humanity was offering partnership, and they were doing so from a position of strength, which meant the offer came without desperation or pleading. The council could accept humanity as equals now, or face them as rivals. Later, the report concluded with Zixthor's personal observation that humanity had left Earth in silence because they had learned that asking for respect gained nothing. They had departed their homeworld because they understood that freedom was never given, but only taken. They had shown the galaxy that a species with determination and unity could accomplish the impossible and reshape the balance of power in ways no one predicted. And Haven John Blake read the intercepted report and allowed himself a small smile before returning to work. There were 3 new colony ships ready to launch, and 20 more worlds waiting to be claimed, and a civilization to build that would stand for thousands of years. Humanity had left Earth behind, but they carried its memory with them, and they would make sure that no human child would ever again be told they needed permission to reach for the stars.